Hi, I'm Michelle Sterling for Friends of Science Society. You know, for decades, Canadians watched Dr. David Suzuki wandering about in the wilderness in his little beaded vest, telling us all about the wonders of the nature of things. People relied on him as being one of the most credible people in television. And yet today, at the Climate Emergency Unit, which is a David Suzuki Institute project, Seth Klein is proclaiming a letter that was written to CBC management by David Suzuki and several other former presenters, demanding that the CBC cover the climate emergency like the emergency that they say that it is. Now, people should remember that Dr. Suzuki famously once said, "Humans are just like maggots defecating all over the place." That's what he thinks of you. And people should famously remember his interviews in Australia, where one man in the audience challenged him on his climate catastrophe view, and Dr. Suzuki did not even know the names of the data sets used by climate scientists.
So where are you getting your information? I'm not a climatologist. I wait for the climatologists to tell us what they're thinking.
Well, you want to respond to that, Bill?
Sure, yeah. UAH, RSS, HADCRUT, GIS data shows a 17-year flat trend, which suggests there may be something wrong with the CO2 warming theory.
Yeah. What is the reference? I don't...
Well, they're the main data sets that IPCC use. UAH, University of Alabama, Huntsville, GIS, Goddard Institute of Space Science, HADCRUT, I don't know what that stands for, HADCRUT, and RSS, Remote Sensing Something. So those data sets suggest a 17-year flat trend, which suggests there may be a problem with the CO2.
There may be a climate skeptic down in Huntsville, Alabama, who has taken the data and come to that conclusion. I say let's wait for the IPCC report to come out and see what the vast bulk of scientists who've been involved in gathering this information will tell us.
So he's hardly an authority on climate change. The CBC journalistic standards state, in terms of conflict of interest, that journalists are expected to be impartial and independent. And yet in this letter that apparently was written in May of 2023, but has only now been released to the public, in this letter they're demanding that CBC actually engage in propaganda on the climate emergency. And I'm going to say the alleged climate emergency, because if you read the climate report of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in the AR6 version, you will find that climate emergency and climate crisis are mentioned only once each, and only in reference to media coverage. You would think in a scientific report, if there was truly a climate emergency, it would be on every page, but it's not. So you may say, well, where does this climate emergency come from? How can it be that Antonio Guterres claims that it's code red for humanity? That's what he said when that report came out. It's because there's another little report, a summary for policymakers it's called. It's a 40-page summary of what's in the report, except in contrast to how the scientific report is written, the 40-page report is written by a room full of delegates. First, a summary is written, then this room full of government delegates goes through it line by line. They project it on the screen, they highlight the line to be agreed upon, there's discussion, changes, a gavel comes down once everyone is in agreement, and they move on. So that is a political document. It's not a scientific document anymore. And some of the easiest evidence to show that is that in the IPCC AR6 summary for policymakers, it used a graph which was called in the climate community the sun of the hockey stick. They used a dramatic graph showing a dramatic increase in warming, but it's nowhere in the science report. So Suzuki and friends here have written to Brodie Fenlon and others at CBC demanding that there should be like daily climate emergency updates. They're very happy to see that one show on CBC actually has a daily measure of CO2 concentration, which is ludicrous because CO2 concentration in the atmosphere varies radically every year because of seasonal change. When it becomes spring, all of the CO2 that has been gathered in the atmosphere during the wintertime is taken up by all the trees and plants as they grow. And then once fall comes around, once again, carbon dioxide concentration starts building up in the atmosphere. Once again, when spring comes around, all that carbon dioxide is taken up because it's plant food. So, you know, the David Suzuki Institute, the David Suzuki Foundation, and the fact that David Suzuki is using his decades-long experience with CBC to try and push propaganda when it's against the CBC's own guidelines, their own journalistic standards. And we already know that the CBC has done terrible things, like calling Professor William Van Wijngaarden a denier, when he's actually done all the science to evaluate changes in climate in Canada. And the people that they're elevating as if climate heroes are a group of young people who probably couldn't do any of the math associated with the work that Professor Wijngaarden has done. So if you look at the Climate Emergency Unit page and the David Suzuki Institute page, you'll find that they're actually advocating for a Wartime Measures Act to force Canadians to mandatorily comply with various climate goals, supposedly in order to meet the climate emergency. But since there's no climate emergency, there's no need for such legislation. If you want to see some more scientists who claim there's no climate emergency and offer the evidence as to why, go to clintel.org. It's the Climate Intelligence Unit out of the Netherlands, and they have almost 2,000 scientists and scholars who declare that there's no climate emergency, and they give the reasons why. So I hope that you'll take a good look at this and be prepared to push back on the claim of a climate emergency, to push back on any effort to impose mandatory measures to force you to comply with climate ideology. And I hope that you will push back at the CRA against David Suzuki Foundation, because this kind of propaganda is not providing a net public benefit. For Friends of Science Society, I'm Michelle Sterling.